Good morning. I'm chairman of the advisory board of the World Trade Center. My name is Corrado Giaccona, and I'm CEO of Giaccona Container Company, and I've been the company's 93 years old this year and been involved in the plastics industry. So it's very appropriate that perhaps I introduce this group to you today. A very distinguished panel, I must say. The moderator for this panel on local and global trends in oil and gas sector is Mr. Tyler Gray. Tyler is the chief counsel for the Louisiana Mid-Continental Oil and Gas Association. He provides support, testifies, lobbies the Louisiana legislative and executive branches on all oil and gas issues. Previously, he was an attorney in the Department of Natural Resources, Office of Conservation, providing legal advice on all regulations enforced by conservation. I would like all of us here perhaps to give a warm welcome, World Trade Center welcome to this distinguished panel.
Thank you very much. So what we wanted to do today is I was going to go through and introduce the other three panelists that we have here, and we wanted to have an informal discussion to be able to answer your questions on this topic. So what I'm going to do is go first and introduce each one, and then I have a question that I would start it off with and let them answer individually. And then if you'd like to ask a question, go ahead and raise your hand, and then if you'd stand up so we can all hear you, and then we'll just go from there. So first, we have Eric Smith, who is a professor of practice at the A.B. Freeman School of Business at Tulane University, serving as the Associate Director of the Tulane Energy Institute. In this role, he works on various interdisciplinary projects relating to energy issues, including teaching both undergraduate and graduate energy courses. Prior to his current role, he spent 36 years in the downstream petrochemical industry, offshore drilling, and construction sectors. He has served as a consultant in economic development at the national, state, and local level, including traveling abroad on trade missions. He has provided policy recommendations for onshore and offshore activities at the national level. He has authored reports relating to LNG, changes in the offshore construction market, Louisiana's competitiveness in industrial power generation, pet coke as a fuel in the domestic power generation market, the potential economic and social benefits of a new crude oil pipeline linking South Sudan, Uganda, and Kenya, and most recently, a report that deals with the positive economic impact of the U.S. oil and gas shale activity on the Louisiana economy. And finally, he is Tulane's media spokesman on energy issues, a 1965 graduate of Georgia Tech in chemical engineering and an MBA in 1967 from Tulane. Here at the end, we have Jason French, who is the Vice President of Government and Public Affairs. Prior to joining Tellurian, Mr. French managed state government and public affairs for Cheniere Energy and its multi-billion-dollar LNG export projects in Louisiana and Texas. Mr. French's professional experience includes serving as the Director of Government Affairs for BP's Gulf of Mexico division, holding key leadership roles during the Deepwater Horizon spill response, and directing government affairs for CSX Transportation, a major railroad serving the eastern U.S. Jason is currently on the boards of the World Trade Center for New Orleans and Counsel for a Better Louisiana. Originally from Kentucky, Mr. French is a graduate of the University of Louisville. He lives in Houston with his wife Andrea and two kids. And lastly, here in the middle, we have Will Fediw, who is the Director of Marine Operations and Regulatory Compliance at Venture Global, which is currently developing 2 LNG export facilities in the state of Louisiana. Will leads the forecasting, development, and acquisition of marine transport assets and strategies, as well as a regulatory implementation. Furthermore, he oversees simulation modeling and feasibility studies for vessel navigation, berthing compatibility, and scheduling. Regularly liaisoning with the U.S. Coast Guard, port authorities, pilots, and other government entities, Will serves as an internal advisor regarding marine and waterway issues for Venture Global LNG. Prior to joining Venture Global, Will served in the United States Coast Guard, specializing in regulatory compliance for petrochemical tankers and liquefied gas carriers, as well as petrochemical and liquefied gas waterfront terminals. A resident of the Lake Charles area, Will brings a unique and thorough understanding of the maritime industry supply chain, community outreach, and energy project development. In addition to his role with Venture Global, Will is the vice chair of the Louisiana Energy Export Association, or LEA. Will is a graduate of Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia, earning a business degree in maritime supply chain management. So to get started, the first question that I have, and we would go through and just go down the line here and talk about it, is I want to look back to testimony by Alan Greenspan in 2003 when he was the Federal Reserve Chairman in front of the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Energy and Commerce. Mr. Greenspan said, and this is me paraphrasing, "The lack of infrastructure in the U.S., the challenge to liquefy and transport, and high gas prices will make imports to the U.S. a challenge going forward," speaking of natural gas and LNG. What can you all talk about that has changed in the last 15 years, and how does Louisiana fit in this role? We'll start with Eric.
Well, I guess the first point you'd make is that times change. And the particular changes in our case were, if you go back 15 years, we were short of natural gas. We weren't finding any additional gas. We had some associated gas coming out of the oil fields. But we were on a tear to build LNG import terminals. And that's when Sharif Suki got interested in finding a location along the Louisiana coast or Texas coast where he could build a new import terminal. We had several stacked or idle terminals that had been built back in the 70s and 80s that were now being reconditioned and brought back on stream. Actually, the longest continuously operating terminal in the U.S. is in Boston. So when you hear the Bostonians complaining about LNG, ask them to look out the window of their office buildings and they can see the terminal. It's pretty obvious. So that's the background or the context that Alan Greenspan was speaking from. The liquefaction activity and the transportation activity related to the fact you were going to have to build these onshore terminals around the world wherever there was a gas supply at a cost of billions of dollars, usually in places that didn't have billions of dollars. You were going to have to build ships that cost a couple of $100 million a pop, and depending on how far away you were going to need several of those. And it was a world of bilateral arrangements. So you had, LNG coming out of Bonny Island in Nigeria, and it was coming to specific ports in the U.S. You had gas coming out of some of the other locations in Africa and elsewhere. Eventually, some gas coming out of Norway. But the point was, there was no real spot market for LNG. You finance these projects, and these fellows can speak to that more than I can, but you finance these projects on a project financing basis under 20-year contracts, and the LNG went from one point to another point, just like a pipeline. What's changed and what's different is that post-2008, we had a new way of producing natural gas from the source rock, and that's the so-called shale revolution. That started in the Barnett Shale in sort of north-central Texas, very quickly morphed into Louisiana in the Haynesville Shale at one point. We had 160 rigs working in the Haynesville. It was the biggest gas field in the United States. It produced a dry gas that was ideal for putting into the pipeline system and moving to power plants where we were concerned about CO2 and these sorts of things. So post that 2003 statement, the world changed. And when we talk about disruptive technology, the idea of combining two older technologies to produce gas from shale, horizontally drilled wells, was about as disruptive as they come. So that's what changed as far as I'm concerned.
I'd probably just briefly add to that, as you mentioned before, LNG in the United States wasn't necessarily something new at that time. It had been around for a long time. The first export of LNG coming out of the Lake Charles area in the 50s, and there were these import terminals that were built around the United States, in the 70s and 80s. So there was a level of infrastructure there. There was a level of pipeline structure that was there. And the LNG carriers that were bringing gas in, they're the exact same ships. You know, importing or export didn't matter from the shipping side. And then when, as he mentioned, where now the U.S. had this abundant supply of gas, facilities were looking to essentially switch the valve from import to export and now take the gas that we had originally coming into or that we were developing here and exporting it out, turning some of these brownfield regas facilities into liquefaction terminals by adding the liquefaction technology.
I think Will and Eric have largely covered, we may have to start on this end sometimes. Because no, I think you cannot overstate how big the change was. Of course, it was about the abundant supply. It was about, we always knew that gas was there, but the fact that American innovation led us to be able to retrieve that in an economic way to make it viable to produce the shale gas was what resulted in this revolution. But you really can't overstate how significant the change has been. I mean, the Greenspan's testimony, I don't even think fully captures it. It's you know, revolution is what we always say, and there's really no better word for it. If you just look at how we watched back when we actually watched the evening news 15 years ago, we always watched it with an eye towards the Middle East and how geopolitical happenings in the Middle East affected our energy politics. The fact is, in the last 15 years, yes, we've been able to move from imports to exports, but we've also been able to change our geopolitical position vis-a-vis the world because of energy politics, because we have become what I always say, we were the poster child of global energy consumption, and in 15 short years, we flipped that to become a global energy superpower, and so much of that is happening here in Louisiana. Sharif was mentioned, who was the chairman of Cheniere and was CEO of Cheniere, is now chairman of Tellurian. And I think it was, again, and not to just brag on Sharif, but again, it was American innovation that said, I remember there was a reporter out of New York who told Sharif, or who wrote an article when Sharif was trying to move towards exports around 2010, and said, you'll need snow boots in hell before that will work. And when on the day we opened the facility, that reporter got a pair of snow boots sent to him in New York. So, you know, it required American leadership and innovation to do something that just not that long ago, 8 years ago, so many people in the industry didn't believe was possible. And now today, you know, that's when Sharif was on the forefront, but today you've got Venture doing 2 projects in Louisiana. You've got under construction or going to very likely begin construction this decade, $90.1 billion worth of projects. So it is nothing short of revolutionary what's happened.
Well, I have a follow-up question with that. We'll start at that end, give Jason an opportunity to talk a little bit about it. So you talked a little bit about the projects that are being announced here in Louisiana. So what makes Louisiana attractive for LNG facilities or potential growth here?
There are a lot of things that make Louisiana attractive. One, and when I was with Cheniere, and before I was with Cheniere, when Sharif was looking at sites, we looked from Maine to Brownsville, Texas, and the first site we settled on was in Louisiana. Some obvious things: the resources here, the gas is here, the pipeline infrastructure. There's a robust pipeline infrastructure that we all know. I mean, we can build a 94-mile or 96-mile pipeline out of the Tellurian facility and essentially access every molecule of gas in the country by just building one 96-mile pipeline. So you can't overstate those pieces, but also the political will of Louisiana, being familiar with the oil and gas industry, understanding the role that the oil and gas industry plays in the state, and being receptive to a new type of oil and gas project. We haven't faced the type of opposition that, even down in Brownsville, Texas, that some of the projects are facing. We haven't faced that type of opposition that you've seen on the East Coast and the West Coast with other projects. So the political will, and then the last thing I'll say is I know depending on where you are in the industry, there may be differences of opinions on this, but the state regulatory structure is very positive in Louisiana. I mean, having done with Cheniere, worked a project in Texas as well, and Texas always ends up on the list as being the best places to do business, and there are reasons for that. But when you're building a multi-billion-dollar project, our management team comes down on the side of Louisiana every time because the regulators work with you. They are partners. They hold you to standards, but they partner with you, and that has been an important piece as well.
Just to quickly add 2 pieces on there. One is, as he mentioned before, community that is receptive to LNG. You know, I'm a resident of the Lake Charles area, and over there, LNG is old hat. So to announce that you're doing another project, they're excited about it, but they've already been there and done that, so they're very welcoming of, they know it can work. And so they say, come on in, let's do it. There's also the qualified workforce, an abundance of qualified workforce in Louisiana, from the tradecraft position for construction, but also for operators in the petrochemical industry. So there's this wealth of a workforce and labor to pull from. And also, as you all know, there's the deep water access. You know, both in the Calcasieu River and the Mississippi, this is a great strategic point in the access to the Gulf of Mexico to get gas around the world. So all these things combined is what makes projects typically look first in the Louisiana area of bringing in these mega projects.
I'd also just add one point to our LNG specialists, which is if you're trying to finance things and you're trying to do it on a long-term basis with project financing, Louisiana is essentially a fairly stable place where the rules tend to be the same a year from now or 5 years from now than they are today. Of course, as soon as I say that, something will change, but that's been the experience so far. Remember, at one point, when we were facing this shortage of natural gas in the United States, there was a total of 42 import terminals that people were talking about building in various places because nobody wanted to be cut short. We actually ended up building, Jason, you all correct me, but I think it was 6 or 7 of those actually got built, and then we brought back the brownfield sites. But we went from 0 to 42 and then actually completed 6 or 7. And that was all based on forecasts of how much natural gas we were going to need. The shale, meanwhile, had been plugging along with various trials, George Mitchell in Texas primarily, in the Barnett. And his idea was very simple. We knew there was energy in this source rock. We knew it was bound up in very dense carbonaceous rock. And he was trying to figure out how to get it out. And actually, not generally known, the federal government helped with some funding to try and develop the technology. Eventually, between his efforts and Devon's efforts, they got these two technologies together, the ability to drill horizontally and the ability to sequentially frack. And it's childishly simple. If I drill through 50 feet of rock and perforate it, I'm going to get the gas that's around that 50 feet. If I drill it horizontally for 8,000 feet, I'm going to get the gas around the 8,000 feet. So I don't need a very high yield of material coming out of the source rock. I just need to expose as much source rock as possible. And that's why the shale gas worked, and eventually that shale technology was applied in the Bakken to oil and ultimately to the Permian Basin and others. So the shale fracking technology really was not only a revolution in the natural gas business, but it also was a revolution in terms of producing light, sweet crude oil and natural gas liquids, which is my favorite subject. Not necessarily Sharif's, but certainly mine. These are the things that come out of the gas that have to be removed before you can put the gas in the pipeline. And to Corrado's point, that's the things that get turned into plastics. So when you read about these foreign companies building petrochemical plants all along the Gulf Coast, a lot of them in Texas, but also a lot of them in Louisiana. There's even one being built in Pennsylvania. But those so-called steam crackers and dehydrogenation units are the starting point for taking those gas liquids and turning them into plastics that we can either use domestically or we can export. So it's been a boon for export activity at the gas level, at the natural gas liquids level, at the crude oil level, and at these chemically modified product level, at least in bulk. We still have some work to do in terms of the downstream conversion so that we don't have to export all of this material to somewhere else.
So I want to move a little bit from talking about it from a general nature of Louisiana being attractive for LNG companies, and we'll kind of keep this next question LNG focused. Will, could you talk a little bit about what made your company choose Plaquemine Parish? You know, we've seen a lot of the announcements come in Southwest Louisiana, but there have been a couple recently that you had a recent announcement, Port Fourchon, which is in down at the southern portion of Louisiana, that has announced that they have an $800 million LNG project that they're looking at. Venture Global is looking at Plaquemine Parish. Is there something we don't know about Plaquemine? Is there something we should see in the future? So if you could make some comments about that.
Sure. So our company, Venture Global, we're developing our second project, which is the Plaquemines LNG project. It's on the Port of Plaquemines property. We're the anchor tenant there, and it's a 630-acre parcel with room to expand, and that's going to be about a 20 million ton facility. But to your question, when you look to the western part of the Gulf, you know, all the way from Corpus, all the way through Houston, Port Arthur, now Lake Charles, it's extremely congested. You're physically just running out of room to put mega projects because you look for sites that are viable, and so to get that right site, you know, they're not necessarily just laying around. So we began to look east, and I'll be the first to admit we weren't the first ones to look east. There were other companies that did. And there's companies now that are looking east because it has almost the identical qualities of Southwest Louisiana, where you have qualified workforce, you have naturally deep water. The Mississippi is fantastic for this. You also have pipeline infrastructure. So I would almost say there's room to grow, and it allows projects to potentially diversify a little bit. So I would not be surprised if, you know, we have our company developing right now, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's more.
So this is a question for Eric, actually. Will mentioned the congestion that we've got here. For those of you all that don't know, Louisiana, the port of South Louisiana, so the whole structure is one of the largest by tonnage in the entire world. I believe that statistic is correct. And then if you look at 96% of all manufacturing, according to the American Chemistry Council, originates with hydrocarbons, being oil, coal, all those type of products. Now, Louisiana continues to be a leader in the petrochemical and refining industry. And you talk about the congestion here on the river, it's because we have all these assets. Beyond just the Mississippi River, what makes Louisiana a leader in that space?
Well, I think we talked about the historical context earlier. Louisiana has always been an extractor of resources from the natural environment, going back to the days of the American Indians and the French and Spanish. The extraction of oil and natural gas, primarily oil, back in the turn of the century and then offshore starting in 1947, meant that there was a driver to locate the processing equipment near where the material was being sourced. In fact, the Gulf of Mexico still is increasing in terms of oil production. We like to take credit for it, but in fact, the oil that we're getting, the incremental increase right now is based on things we did and decisions we made 5 or 10 years ago. It's not a very quick turnaround business, offshore oil and gas. Shale's a little different. But as I believe others have mentioned, when you have a whole state, 4.5 million of us or so, who are comfortable with the fact that you can produce oil and gas, whose families may have been involved for 4 or 5 generations in the production and processing of oil and gas, it's a little different than if you're going into the upper Hudson or someplace like that and saying, we want to build this great plant next door to the power plant, and we're going to, produce all of this oil and natural gas into products that you use. They would rather see us do that down here because we're comfortable with it, and they will pay a penalty to get it shipped to them. So that's, I think, one of the big drivers. You do see some anomalies. I mean, for example, in the area up around Chicago, people in the industry refer to that as Pad 2. Pad 2 is a big user of heavy sour crude, and it has been for a number of years. That heavy sour crude all comes from Western Canada by pipeline. 96% of the crude imports that the Chicago area refineries depend on comes from Canada, and will continue to come from Canada. We have a little less secure situation. 45% of our oil comes from Venezuela. Or let me rephrase that. Of the U.S. imports of crude oil from Venezuela, Louisiana is 45%. That's not a good place to be. And yes, there can be some substitution with the shale oil. There can be some substitution with natural gas. But at the end of the day, the refineries we built, this sort of corridor between the mouth of the river and Baton Rouge, those refineries cost $1.5 billion or so a piece, and they are designed specifically to run on this heavy sour crude nobody wanted. All of our light sweet crude, the good stuff, if you will, we always shipped to the inland refineries because we couldn't afford to use it. So we were substituting higher capital costs for lower cost crude, and now the lower cost crude supply is threatened. So that's not the best news in the world, but that's sort of the situation we're in right now.
You guys have anything you want to throw in? Well, then I want to jump back to a comment that, Eric, that you made a couple of minutes ago. Use the word stability. And I want to start with Jason on this. You know, we have seen across the country states struggling with their state budgets. Illinois has been having trouble. California has had trouble for years. And most recently, since 2015, Louisiana has had significant trouble. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your company, and then Will, yours, and then Eric, just sort of a general view, because in my experience, Louisiana is a leader when it comes to stability with a regulatory front. You know, we get a lot of accolades for the ability to work with the agency. You find solutions. Having worked with federal and state permitting processes, you're able to communicate at a great level. In Louisiana, I've heard stories of where you'll have a permit application for competing facilities for the same capital within the same company, and Louisiana facilities can take their permits to the meetings. I mean, that's the speed at which Louisiana is sophisticated enough in order to issue regulatory permits. But that's not been the case with the state budget. How does that affect your company and your view of the state?
So we've talked about all the reasons why we located in Louisiana, but a number of states, as you said, are going through budget crises, and Louisiana is as well, one of its own making. And anytime you're investing 10, 16, $20 billion, stability is important, and stability and certainty of expectations around taxes. And when we are trying to finance one of these multi-billion-dollar projects, we go through extensive modeling. We look at the tax structure, and obviously things can change, but you don't want to get hit with something like, I'll bring up CWIP. Many of us up here on this panel were instrumental in the Constitutional Amendment number 1 campaign that banned or would prevent assessors from assessing taxes on a project under construction. That was a major issue for the LNG industry. Had that amendment not passed, it could have stifled that $90.1 billion of investment we were talking about. Much of that could have gone away because you cannot afford what that would have been for the Cheniere project, for example. It would have been a $200 million tax bill roughly on January 1. It would have crippled those of us who are trying to finance a $16 billion project. For Tellurian, it would have meant $1.1 billion over the course of 6 years, a new tax that we hadn't expected. Louisiana politics are, we always brag in Louisiana that Louisiana is different from the other 49 states, and their politics are too, and it does add a certain level of uncertainty. I think it is important and something that we've talked to the governor, and I'm sure Will has as well, but we've talked to the governor and the legislature about whatever changes come in policy around taxes and around the budget, it needs to be cognizant that it doesn't impact us during the construction phase. I mean, the Venture Global, Tellurian, these are not household names outside Louisiana. These are small companies that are being entrepreneurial, innovative, and trying to get these projects off the ground. What we cannot afford, I don't know your finances, but I know we're not making any money. We cannot afford unexpected $200 million taxes that fall out of the sky. And so that's something that we've been trying to convey to the state leadership. We want to pay our fair share. As we become operational, we can be a significant tax generator for the state, but we cannot absorb significant taxes that affect us on the construction piece. Those are the type of policy decisions that could chase this once in a lifetime LNG revolution that's happening in Louisiana, could chase it from the state.
Just very briefly on that point, like you'd mentioned, things like CWIP, huge deal. Things like ITEP, big deal. And when companies are looking to locate, Louisiana is a large concentration of LNG producers, but there's other states that also do it well. I mean, as well, there's projects in Texas, there's projects in Florida, kind of opening up a little bit. So to Jason's point, is some of these incentive programs is what helps with the other items we've mentioned already make Louisiana so attractive to invest money there. Because every dollar that's spent on a project all boils down into the price of gas. And so for us to be competitive in the global market, the gas needs to be cheaper than the competition. So all these type of incremental costs play a big deal into that and make these projects or this location attractive to develop.
Just a quick note, Will mentioned ITEP. So for those of you all that don't play in this space, Louisiana has a few economic tax incentives here in the state. It's called the Industrial Tax Exemption program. And so here we are in New Orleans, the largest city in Louisiana, but a lot of us in the energy industry spend time all over the state, all 64 parishes. So the parish in which the facility is located, usually the largest taxpayer is industry. And so one of the things that's a big deal to these companies are these tax incentives in that program. So the industrial tax exemption has been modified recently during some governmental regulations. So as Jason mentioned, that becomes an issue with modeling, expectations, taxation, what your finances are expected to be. So I just wanted to add that point. When you're in this space, we really get into it and use those acronyms, but that's what ITEP stands for. Sorry, Eric, go ahead.
Well, the only thing I was going to add is another one of those differentiators for Louisiana. All states have fairly strong economic development groups. Louisiana's maybe one of the strongest, and I don't mean by pushing people around. I just mean they're very professional. They've spent a long time under both Democrats and Republicans figuring out how to attract companies to the area. Usually that involves tax exemptions, but it also involves things like training grants and setting up specialized programs at the junior college level to train operators. It includes working with various trade groups to get more qualified welders. We do a lot of welding, and particularly in LNG plants, it's all cryogenic alloys, so it's a very specialized sort of welding. We end up attracting welders from all over the country, but a lot of them are homegrown, and that, again, is included in that package. The last thing I'll say about this is that LED, Louisiana Economic Development, goes out of its way to do what the federal government is trying to do right now, which is to streamline this permitting process so that you don't go through and get 4 permits and then wait a year to get 2 more and then wait another year to get the final one. They're all timed and lined up so that you're not entering a lot of duplicative information and waiting for people to come up to speed. Economic development is reports to the governor directly, and it's been supported generally pretty well by the entire state legislative and political community. And I think it's one of those differentiators that you can't overlook.
So you all have mentioned sort of the competition, what makes Louisiana attractive. Well, as we can see, this is Louisiana International Trade Week, and one of the things that we all experience in this industry is that you do compete on a global scale. And to kind of create that framework and that context, I want to, we do have some natural gas experts here on the panel, so I want to talk a little bit about how we compete at the international level, okay? So a lot of the LNG contracts that we've heard about have been centered around Asia's energy market. So can you all talk a little bit about, well, what about the European countries? How about Africa? Do you see Louisiana providing LNG exports to sophisticated countries in Europe or other developing nations? So I just wanted to kind of open that up to the group.
Yeah, I'll start briefly. You're correct. When you look at the latest International Gas Union report, shows that 69% of LNG is going to the Asian market. So that's an established market. It'll continue to be there. But when you look at Europe, Europe is also LNG is not new to Europe either, and it's very bright. I mean, both of the SPAs that we've signed so far, one was with a Shell subsidiary, and then also our most recent one was sold to an Italian utilities company. So the interesting thing about what Europe is doing is they're looking for that stability. They're looking, when you look at mostly getting their gas sourced from Eastern Europe, where there's some geopolitical instability, and we all remember a few years ago when there was the threatening to shut the pipeline down and everything like that. And so they look to the U.S. as a geopolitically stable source of abundant, cheap gas. So that market is ripe as well. And as far as developing markets, there's a ton of developing markets. When you look in Asia and even newer parts of the Middle East, if the buyers can get it there, I mean, we're already seeing all kinds of new ways to get the gas to these consumers in creative ways.
I think you covered that very well. On international competition, I think it's important to note, and when I speak with groups, I tell them, to meet global demand, and global demand for LNG is expected to grow significantly, to be one of the biggest growth in fuels globally between now and 2035. But in that time frame, a major LNG facility, something the size of what Cheniere has built down in Sabine Pass, what Tellurian is going to build, what Venture Global is going to build, has to be built somewhere each year to meet that demand. But it doesn't have to be built in the United States. We have an opportunity here to meet that demand, and that's been what companies like ours have been on the forefront of doing, is trying to meet that demand and make sure that those benefits of the development accrue in the United States. But there's certainly, now Australia has there are a whole host of issues, but Australia has moved into, I don't know if they're number one yet, but they're number two, I think, behind Qatar. There are other nations that want to do what we are doing, and that's where people always ask me, well, I always say we're not Coke and Pepsi. Like we can work collaboratively. We're going after the same in the global marketplace. But the real competition is not between Venture Global and Tellurian. The real competition is between the United States and Australia. The real competition is what nations and what systems can adjust to the new pricing structure. When Cheniere started, the SPAs that provided the foundation for Cheniere were 20-year long-term take-or-pay SPAs. Customers aren't looking to sign those now necessarily. Now we're still trying to, but customers are looking for a more diversified portfolio in their contracts. So the U.S. is going to have to be innovative again. We're going to have to adapt to the changes that we've actually caused in the global LNG industry, to ensure that development and those customers continue to look to the U.S. for their LNG supplies going forward.
I'm just going to tag one more thing on that. When he was mentioning a really good point about the spot market, where the technology is changing on the shipping side to allow spot markets to be more possible due to saving on boil-off gas, et cetera. But spot contracts right now are still only about 25% roughly of the contracts. And the long-term play, which people thought were going away, is actually still a very real thing. I mean, we look at the two SPAs, like I said, that our company signed so far, they're both 20-year fixed contracts. And so that's pretty interesting that the market, they want to choose, based on their individual needs. And as he mentioned as well, like Europe looking to diversify their portfolio of gas supply to kind of meet their needs.
Well, these are the two experts. I'll just add a couple of side comments, if you will. One is we've alluded to the fact in these long-term contracts, there used to be something called a destination clause, which said if I'm shipping to you, European customer, that ship can't go anywhere else. It can only go from point A to point B. More recently, I guess led by the Japanese, there's been a tendency to say, well, let's get rid of those clauses because crude oil, for example, the ownership of the cargo can change 3 times between when it leaves port and when it arrives and discharges. And LNG, I don't think we've done 3 yet, but we can certainly do 2 on a number of occasions. So the ship can change directions and take advantage of a short-term spot market that's short of gas. That's one big change. If you're an economist and you're interested in efficient markets, that helps make them more efficient. The other thing that's really intriguing to me is that the U.S. has a large domestic market for gas, and it's largely set up on a spot basis. It's not really tied to maybe long-term delivery, but the pricing moves around, while the contract's running through. In the rest of the world, they tend to price gas off of oil, crude oil. So if you get a high oil price and a low gas price in the United States, that's the best of all possible worlds. But as those prices get closer together on a BTU basis, it tends to become less and less attractive. What seems to be happening, at least with some of the Asian countries, is they're adopting the U.S. approach and getting away from the oil-indexed approach. It's pretty technical, but that's one of those things that I would expect to add competition to the world market that's not there right now.
So you all brought up sort of the spot pricing concept of it. Well, what I want to do now is talk more about usage, right, domestically and abroad. So I'm going to throw some statistics at you and kind of wanted to get your feelings on it. And maybe, Eric, we can start with you this time. According to the Energy Information Administration, U.S. energy consumption of oil goes from 40% in 1990, 38% in 2015, and is expected to drop to 36% in 2050. While natural gas use is growing from 23% in 1990, 29% in 2015, and expected to grow to 33% in 2050. Do you think the U.S. will be able to produce enough natural gas to consume domestically and continue to export abroad?
And the short answer is yes. I think that we have far more gas reserves in the ground that are identified than we have domestic demand. So we can certainly participate in the international market. Are we going to, run Australia and West Africa into the ground simultaneously? Probably not. But we will be, a significant double-digit producer of gas that's being consumed worldwide. That's just my own feeling, but I think that's a thing you have to look at. The other feature that people tend to ignore is what are the ultimate end uses of the fuel. In the U.S. and in most of the world, liquid fuels have the highest energy density when it comes to transportation. These buses and cars that you see out the window are running on liquid fuels because they can store, a day's supply in a tank that's not very big and provide the requirements. When you go to compressed natural gas, you can do some of that, but now you need to have bigger vessels on board to store the fuel. We have some trucks running around on LNG, for example. LNG is 600 times denser than the gas that you would see at atmospheric pressure, but it's still less dense than diesel or gasoline. So you see a natural proclivity, if you will, and the reason you may see some percentage decline, not absolute, but percentage decline over time, is because the liquids will increasingly be only used for transportation and some petrochemical feedstocks. Natural gas, on the other hand, has its sort of core market, if you will, is feeding the power generation market and substituting for coal. And we've already substituted the oil out in most every location in terms of power generation, other than some emergency generation capability in small single-digit type levels. So one fuel has been focused on large stationary facilities that consume enormous amounts of energy and do it efficiently. The other fuel is more suited to mobile events, whether I'm talking about a car out here or a ship out in the river. they are using liquid hydrocarbons for a reason. It's a dense fuel, and it can supply the cruising range that they need. Those are the only 2 points I would make. Anybody else?
Just touching on the domestic versus the international use. I despise using PowerPoints, but there's one slide that I always do like to use because I think I call it the opportunity slide. We've looked at, and depending on which study you look at, total recoverable resources, you've all heard the numbers. We have a 100-year supply, we have a 150-year supply. Well, let me tell you a little bit about Sharif and Cheniere. When Alan Greenspan made those comments that Tyler started with, Sharif was leading the charge to build an import facility. That was back in 2003, 2004. That facility opened in 2008. It was April of 2008. You could not have pinpointed a worse time to open an import facility. It was $1.6 billion in cost, opened in April 2008, and our stock immediately went through the floor. One of our vice presidents over there called it the world's most expensive paperweight. When you know that history, we wanted to make sure we were right this time. So, Sharif really looked at the numbers. We pulled together the numbers, and what we found, working with a variety of different reports and experts, is that the productive capacity of the U.S. natural gas industry, that within the next decade, we are capable of producing 29 billion cubic feet a day more gas than we can use in this country. And again, we were conservative because you make a $1.6 billion mistake that almost cripples your company. You don't want to make another one. So those figures were based on very aggressive domestic use of the natural gas. It presupposed a far bigger use of LNG or in natural gas in transportation and over the road transportation. It presumed a very significant, basically the doing away of coal plants in this country to be replaced by natural gas. And even with that very robust, aggressive projection for domestic use, we still had 29 billion cubic feet a day that we could produce in this country. So that's what I call the opportunity slide, because that's the slide that justifies, I think, or makes the argument for everything that we're doing in the industry. That's why we should use that 29 billion cubic feet to create billions, tens of billions of dollars of investment in Louisiana, the tens of thousands of construction jobs, all the different impacts that come along from these projects is due to that 29 billion cubic feet of gas that we can produce but not use domestically.
I'd also make the point that one of the customers for the natural gas here in Louisiana that people tend to overlook is all of those petrochemical plants and all of those refineries run on natural gas. They don't run on liquid fuels or coal or anything like that. They produce the process heat, and to the degree that some of them generate their own electricity, it's all done with natural gas.
Let's go ahead and give it to Will. I'm not going to let you get away without getting an answer out here. Want to talk a little bit about, with your experience in the marine sector, both from a regulator and from the private side, you've seen, two different pieces, right? Now, if you could kind of go through and try to process and analyze it from those two different hats and talk about the expansions that you've seen along the port, Mississippi River, what have you seen as these increased shipments, the increased need, the imports, the exports, and that sort of Venture Global's thoughts on that whole thing?
Sure. So, as Eric mentioned before, when you look at natural gas, when you liquefy it, it reduces from, a ratio of 600 to 1. And the real intent of liquefying gas is to transport it in some way. And so when you have these LNG carriers that are essentially giant thermos bottles that float around, LNG, when it's liquefied, is under extremely little pressure, if any. And it's just the cryogenic temperature that keeps it in its liquid state. Shipping LNG, whether importing or exporting in the United States, like I said, is not new. We've been doing it for a while in various ports. It's new now to some ports, like when you think of what's happening on the Mississippi with our second project. But when you look at other places like Calcasieu or Sabine or Boston, these other areas where it's already been done and it's happening. So there are things that kind of projects look at from a technical standpoint, the viability of the waterway. certain ports have dredging issues, some don't. So that's a big concern because some of these LNG carriers can draft upwards of 40 feet. Well, in this case here with the Mississippi, it has a great depth, so that's a strategic advantage. You also look at the maneuverability of the vessel because each class of vessel kind of handles a little bit differently. And when you look at your river pilots and your tug crews, do they have experience with that type of vessel? In certain areas, like I said, they do it a lot, so they're used to it. Other areas, when you're introducing LNG to a port for the first time, there's a lot of training and simulation and modeling that has to be done with the local pilots and the tug handlers to make sure that from a navigation standpoint and from a safety and security standpoint, that these projects and their associated traffic is viable and can be done in a safe way. And I can tell you from firsthand experience from the Coast Guard side and the private side, the amount of interagency and stakeholder collaboration from the Coast Guard, the Army Corps, the Marine stakeholders, the port, the pilots, everyone coming together to say, is the introduction of LNG to a specific port, is it safe? Or for lack of a better term, what's the level of risk and how can we mitigate that to an acceptable level? So again, there's all these different components that go into it, but it's being done and it will continue to be done. And traffic studies that have been done on the various waterways have shown so far that the introduction of LNG traffic right now is not going to pose any type of undue delay or risk to existing traffic and commerce.
Well, so I want to move that over into Eric's space. If you could talk a little bit about keeping with the theme of infrastructure, can you talk a little bit about pipelines? I know you've mentioned heavy sour crude and moving it along, where can that be processed? But could you talk a little bit about the infrastructure
Sure.
to manage that?
We'll start with natural gas. There's well over 300,000 miles of natural gas trunk line in the United States. You have to go out of your way to find a place where you can't get natural gas. There are places. Charleston, South Carolina springs to mind. But if you go up into the mountains to the north of there, they have natural gas pipelines. When you talk about oil pipelines, we have about 66,000 miles of oil pipeline, plus another 30,000 miles out in the Gulf. So we have a lot of liquids pipelines. Refined products, it's about the same, 66,000. So we can move crude oil into the refineries. We can move the refined products themselves, diesel, jet fuel, gasoline, heating oil, in the same pipelines. We can even move them sequentially through the same pipeline, which is pretty amazing if you think about it. And then this last area, the stepchild of the natural gas liquids, we have a significant amount, I don't remember the total, but it's somewhere north of 20,000 miles of pipe, I think, that connect the major locations. We always kid about Houston being the center of the world for the oil and gas industry. Well, Mount Belvieu, Texas, is the center of the world for the gas liquids business. And the gas liquids are having an effect worldwide. One factoid that I always love is in 2008, before the shale revolution, we were a net importer of propane. So propane, butane are the things you use in your barbecue pits and people use for heating in the wintertime and things like that. Today, we're the world's largest exporter of propane. And the only thing that changed, you can look at the plot on the amount of these materials that were coming out of the refineries. It hasn't moved a bit, maybe 500,000 barrels a day. What changed is the stuff coming out of the gas fields went from 2 million barrels a day to 4 million barrels a day. And that is what is driving, Jason mentioned this $90 billion. I don't think it's that big, but it's probably 30 billion or so for the petrochemical guys. And that's plants being built along the Gulf Coast of the United States. We had 31 of the 33 plants in the United States that could do this work in Texas or Louisiana. And all of the new ones, with the exception of one in Pennsylvania, have been built in Texas and Louisiana. So we are taking advantage of those gas liquids. We can deliver them through this existing infrastructure. We're building more infrastructure. on all of these products. But at the end of the day, that's what is driving this petrochemical build-out. And that's why you see the Chinese building methanol plants in Louisiana, and that's why you see Sasol, the South African company, building crackers, and Dow building additional crackers. There's just an announcement this past week of another $2 billion worth, more or less, of cracker capacity, not in Plaquemines Parish, but Plaquemine, Louisiana, and in Texas. So we are in a great place, as you usually are when you're dealing with commodities. If you have the low-cost feedstock, you are the winner. And yes, there are shipping anomalies that come up where it's cheaper to do it in a higher cost plant. But it doesn't make your life necessarily easier, but it gives you an economic driver to go look for ways to increase the share of market that accrues to the U.S. Having said that, if there are any pipeline people in the room, the pipeline is never where we find the oil and gas. So we end up having to go out and build not only the feeders to get it into a processing plant, but then the trunk lines, the interstate highways, if you will, of pipelines. We have to build in additional capacity. Just one example, there's a pipeline called Colonial that runs all the way up the eastern seaboard, starts in Houston and ends in Linden, New Jersey. That pipeline is probably 40 years old. It's actually two pipelines parallel. It's been running at full capacity for the last 7 years. Now, if you want to go build another one, you can go to each one of those states between New Jersey and Texas, and you will need a permit from each of those locations. It's a little easier with gas pipelines because you can get eminent domain authorization from FERC, which is a federal agency. But for oil liquid pipelines, you still have to go to each state. So it's not a perfect system. Infrastructure really, really matters, and particularly even when you have a lot of good news, like, okay, we've got a lot of oil and gas coming out of the ground, it's not always the right kind of oil, and the gas is not always in the right location. And that's the engineer's job to figure out how to get the right infrastructure designed, but it's all of our job to figure out how to get the state legislatures and the federal government to go along with the permitting that's required. And nobody, I think, would have guessed how much of a fight we had over Dakota Access, or the fight that's still ongoing over Keystone XL. Those pipelines were it made every bit of engineering and economic sense, but they did impinge on what people's perception of what was good for the most people, and as a result, they got tied up. And you saw diametrically opposed positions between the Obama administration and the Trump administration as to what side was more important. That's why I say all of us have to pay attention, because if we don't, you see some bad decisions being made. Thank you.
So those are all great points. We talk about infrastructure from the marine side, from moving product from the pipeline side. Well, for those of you all that aren't familiar with my employer, Louisiana Mid-Continent Oil and Gas Association, we represent all sectors of the oil and gas industry, everything from, we work with LNG companies, we have the major oil and gas companies that do exploration and production in the Gulf of Mexico, gas producers in the north, the refiners, the oldest state trade association. So I feel comfortable with what I'm about to say, and that is the oil and gas industry has not done a good job of communicating how important oil and gas is to everyday lives. And so what I have been doing recently is spending more time explaining why oil and gas is you experience and work with it or deal with it every single day. In some form or fashion, you will deal with that. Now, a person up here on this panel does an excellent job at building out infrastructure from the community standpoint. So, Jason, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your experience, whether with BP, whether with Cheniere, CSX, or with Tellurian now, with the great job that you do in building out infrastructure for community outreach, public relations, all that kind of stuff here in the state of Louisiana.
Well, thanks, Tyler. Yeah, it is something that we take a great deal of pride in, and you did kind of trace the roots. For those of you who don't know, you heard in my bio, I worked for BP in Oklahoma and Kansas doing government affairs. Was hired in April of 2009, and in April 2010, I got a phone call and said, get to Louisiana. I had never stepped foot in the state of Louisiana at that time. I'd never been to New Orleans. I'd never stepped foot in Louisiana, and I came in when my employer had just caused what was believed to be probably the worst environmental disaster in U.S. history. Had some interesting roles, but one, for those of you who know the area of Grand Isle, I was, Buddy Caldwell, the then Attorney General, called our CEO, Tony Hayward, and said, we have civil unrest on Grand Isle. The governor is actually considering deploying the National Guard into Grand Isle. And all joking aside, actually Jefferson Parish Sheriff's deputies and Grand Isle City Police had commandeered our vessels of opportunity boats at gunpoint because they did not believe, and to their point, they were correct, that BP was deploying those boats correctly. So I tell you all that to say, I got the call on a Saturday after Tony Hayward got the call. Your next assignment is to be the company guy in Grand Isle. So I got there, and very quickly we had a town hall and a couple hundred people in a church and media from all over the world, and people just got up, and there was a lot of heat in the room, not a lot of light, as they say. And there were people who genuinely were impacted. Every nightly news broadcast was being done from Grand Isle because oil was actually coming into people's backyards. A couple things I learned that day is sometimes people just need to be heard. And secondly, I never wanted to do a town hall like that again. So I did something that we've actually, and it's a long story, but it tells you what we've done on the LNG side, and it's been quite effective. But to know the origins of it, because I didn't want to have another one of those town halls, it wasn't just because I didn't want to, because my mom read the next day on the front page of the paper in Louisville, Kentucky, that Jason French might as well have painted a bullseye on his back. So when your mother and grandmother read that, you start getting calls. That was an AP story. But I actually went and asked one of the shrimpers who was out of work, and said, what would you think about having your neighbors on your street, 10, 15, 20 people, come over, we'll be able to answer every question they have, I'll bring my entire staff, this is going to be very labor intensive on our side, but we'll buy food, I was new to Louisiana, so I said we're not going to do alcohol. The alcohol always finds its way. But we bought food and the alcohol got there. What he said to me was, I think you'll likely get killed, but I'm happy to do that. And so we had that event, and it was tremendously successful. People were upset, but they had legitimate claim concerns. They had legitimate fears about what were happening. We were able to dispel rumors. And so we started doing those on every street in Grand Isle. I mean, it was very labor intensive for my public affairs team, but we started doing that, and it started to spread across the Gulf. And I'm all about recycling my ideas. And when I got to Cheniere, we started to do the same thing. We started to go into the communities that were going to be affected by these major plants and have that level of outreach, literally going into people's home and throwing dinner parties. And we've done the same thing at Tellurian. And it's been tremendously successful. What I have found is that I have been able to deputize the community to do our jobs for us in many ways. I mean, when you can dispel the rumors about what LNG is, that natural gas will not explode in an unconfined environment. When opponents of these facilities put out the flyer that shows the bomb at Hiroshima, the mushroom cloud, and say, this is what's being built in your backyard. And I've dealt with that. And what I always say is I'm here to dispel those type of rumors. That when they say that it's the energy of one atomic bomb, that's absolutely untrue. The energy in an LNG tanker has the energy of 52 atomic bombs. But then you have to explain. But I get down to that level, and I say that to every home that I've been in. I always say that, and it gets sometimes laughs, sometimes gasps. But then we walk through why it doesn't pose a danger to their community, why this commodity operates in a safe way, what the physical components of it are. So that has been a very effective tool. We do a number of things, obviously, that Venture and others do as well, investment in the community. But doing that real organic outreach has been key to us being successful on the community side in Louisiana. That's been a real key to what we've done.
Yeah, I can't agree with Jason more on this, where especially when you think of the context of being in Louisiana and a very strong state, a very tight-knit state, a state that trust is extremely important, especially when you think about mega projects like BP or others, the ability to go in and really have a grassroots type influence in the community, to be able to have those cups of coffee, to be able to, where they know you, like everybody in Lake Charles knows him, and his staff is around. I live in Lake Charles. That's what's one of my responsibilities as well for the company, where you can walk around and people say, hey, Will, and they know you, and you can talk and build those relationships, because they do become those advocates. They do begin to carry your message. So it's a force multiplier for your own staff, because when you educate them, to his point again, where that it's not scary, and once you provide some education, then everybody's like, oh, okay, this is great, something that could be mitigated, something that has a great industry track record. Then when they hear someone on the street talking about it in an incorrect manner or erroneous facts, then they can deal with that. And then all those things compound into championing support at the government level to facilitate permitting or tax reforms or all these different things, because the community now actually sees you as a genuine ally that cares about them and is coming to make a big economic impact, billions of dollars of direct impact, then secondary and tertiary dollars that go out into the community and create jobs and to create great lives for people. You cannot do anything better than building true, effective relationships.
I'll just add one little anecdote, which is that when you are dealing with the different cultures, whether it's Louisiana or it's West Africa or it's Scotland, people have different sensitivities. And the one I'm always reminded of is I used to get the questions in Europe, why aren't your fishermen fighting more with your oil and gas people? Because in the North Sea, they fight all the time. BP would be no stranger to that environment. And my answer was, because in Louisiana, the guy that owns the shrimp boat, his brother works on the BP platform. And every 2 weeks, they swap positions. So the boat's always working, and BP's always working, but the people understand both sides of the equation. In the North Sea, it's not quite that way. What tended to happen in the North Sea is the trawlers would trawl up the pipelines or the plets or whatever and destroy the infrastructure, and then the oil companies and the government would get on their case. And there was a constant tension between those two groups of people. If you didn't recognize that, or you didn't recognize the tensions in Nigeria between onshore gas use and export of gas at Bonny Island, you were going to never get very far in trying to get a project approved.
Let me just touch one more time on that real quick, because when he brought up the fishermen, it is crucial, especially in the early design phases or even conceptual phases of the company, to go out and when you think about environmental impacts, when you think about fish and wildlife impacts, there's these things that what you're doing may potentially have an impact on someone. It's so advantageous to your company to go sit down with them. I've met with a lot of the fishermen in Plaquemines. I've met with the fishermen in Cameron area. And when we were going through these designs and say, hey, this is what we're proposing to do in the very high level, what do you think? Is this an issue? Is there ways that we can kind of mitigate that? Because then they actually look at these guys. They actually care, and they're asking for our input early on, because it might be a simple tweak in a pipeline route. It might be simply sliding your plot of your project over 100 feet. It could be something incredibly simple that saves you the heartache of, at a FERC public hearing or comment period, here comes these potential groups of people that might be opponents, but you've already mitigated that out of the scenario because you've engaged them first and actually shown them that what they do is important and their opinion actually matters.
Last thing, real quick, just to the success of, and I think the LNG industry has done it well, and other industries struggle in the public affairs space sometimes. But you mentioned the FERC hearing at Cheniere, after having done the type of outreach that I talked about, putting that a face to the company, really engaging the community as partners. When we had our FERC hearing for the Corpus Christi facility that Cheniere was building, FERC comes in, and these hearings are largely held to hear the opposition. There were 150 people in the room, 30 made comments, 29 were incredibly supportive, the 30th had a question. FERC had never seen anything like that. And so you're starting to see that it does really pay dividends to put in those investments in the relationships that we're doing.
It's interesting hearing that dynamic, and I kind of have a follow-up question for you, Eric, on this, but, you use the word perception, and when you look at something like the Dakota Access Pipeline, the perception was that it had significantly affected a particular Native American lands. But when you look at the map of the product, it actually did not go through the lands. It went through an adjacent, not adjacent, but it was close, right? It went through a body of water that they shared with those tribal lands. If they had taken the time beforehand, and I don't know all that, maybe that would have helped it, who knows. But your experience now, you said that speak with the media, and then also you're teaching students. What do you find in their perception when it comes to energy of coming for the growing workforce here?
Well, let's take those one at a time. First of all, Dakota Access had very little to do with indigenous opposition. It had a lot to do with funding from California. And as an article of faith, I take it that many of the environmental community recognize they can't shut down the Canadian tar sands and they can't shut down the refineries. But what they can do is make a mess of trying to get the infrastructure in place. So they deliberately target pipelines and terminals and shipping locations and things like that on the theory that if they can't stop the facility itself, they will go after the infrastructure that makes it possible. So that's the first thing, is there is an organized movement against hydrocarbons. I'm not telling any secrets here. I think everybody knows that. So that's one thing to take into mind. The other thing, I mean, even here in Louisiana, when we talk about building a west to east pipeline from Texas to the refineries around here, the people, I wasn't at the protest, but hearsay evidence, the people that showed up were not all locals from Lake Charles or from the Atchafalaya Basin. There were people from outside who were brought in to protest. So this is something, that none of the three of us, or really nobody in industry or government, can stop. You can't prevent people from speaking their mind, even if they're paid to do it. What you can do is continue to refute the arguments and present the facts. And the government has a hard time refuting facts. If they're provable facts, they will generally carry the day. I hope that helps.
No, it does, very much so. Looking actually at the time now, we have about 5 minutes for questions. So go ahead and take them from the audience. You, sir?
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to something that you mentioned earlier in terms of the overseas markets for LNG. And you said that 69% currently goes to Asia. I just wondered if you could elaborate on that in terms of like how big of a market China currently is for LNG. And the reason I ask that is because earlier this year there was a meeting between U.S. and Chinese officials, and they put out a statement which sort of emphasized that the U.S. is ready and willing to sell natural gas, liquefied natural gas to China. So there seemed to be some sort of misimpression on their part that they couldn't access the U.S. market, I guess. So I just wondered if you could elaborate on that.
So go ahead.
The question is, with this factor of 69% going to Asia versus the fact that the Chinese, at least historically, have not been the biggest customer, and the efforts by the U.S. government to try and increase that percentage. What's the interplay between those two? I'll let the two LNG experts talk about it.
So in short, like I said, that statistic came out of the 2017 report from the IGU LNG report. And so that's what I thought too. And so I refer you there for the full breakdown. I don't have the actual breakdown of the Chinese segment here to offer you, so I won't even pretend to guess at it. I will say though, from a general perspective, that the Chinese market is really showing signs of becoming a large, developing market. There are companies that are actively looking to market their gas to China as a potentially very large source of demand.
And there are cargoes that have left Louisiana and been delivered to China already. Again, demand is going to grow there. You know, we'll often get asked kind of a follow-up on this. Well, don't they also have their own natural gas? And of course, we weren't the only ones blessed with shale, but we were the ones with a mature pipeline network with the expertise to get it out of the ground and to get it into that pipeline network, and the political will thus far to allow the techniques that get that gas out of the ground. You see some of the allies in Europe, that's not necessarily the case. They've banned fracking. So China has gas underneath in its rocks as well, but they still look long-term to be a significant growth market in Asia.
I would just add, when you divide up that 69%, number one, far and away, would be Japan. Number two would be Korea. And both of those places are closer to Australia than they are to the United States. So perhaps our government was trying to get a step ahead and say, you can buy it from Australia, you can buy it from us. We have a cheaper raw material supply. We can afford the extra freight. I think that's probably what they were thinking at the time.
Point of comment, an ambassador to a former Soviet location where the pipeline comes out of Russia to go to Europe made a comment in New Orleans a couple of years ago about he couldn't wait to turn off the spigot from natural gas from Russia and turn on Louisiana natural gas. We all perked up when we heard that. Eric mentioned low-cost feedstock. One thing the group hadn't talked about, and of course everybody knows I have an axe to grind, and that is the low-cost feedstock in Louisiana. We have the lowest cost per kilowatt hour of electricity in the United States. The number one cost of making a plastic product is the resin. Plastic resin amounts on a plastic product, for the most part, 95% of the cost of the output of the product. If Louisiana makes presently so much plastic resin, but where does it ship it? Much of it is shipped to California, which is the largest converter of plastic resin into value-added consumer products. The business in California converting resin is $15 billion a year. They're number one. Texas is number 3 at $11 billion. But Louisiana makes the lowest cost electrical power and makes the resin. One of the things that you mentioned about overlooking and overseeing so many of the areas of the oil and gas industry, I really believe synergy needs to be created in Louisiana to add another level to the oil and gas industry of producing more plastics here. Possibilities are phenomenal, plus Louisiana is the only port system in the world with 6 railheads and all the ports that can generate not only moving product throughout the center of the United States by making it in Louisiana, but it also has a free direct shot to South America and Europe for the exporting of plastic goods. So I'm just curious to know, anybody want to make any comment on that which I've been axe grinding for quite some time now. Go ahead.
Well, I'll take a stab at it. Corrado, basically, the Louisiana and Texas both produce a lot of bulk plastics. Now, I'm not talking about milk bottles or water bottles or anything like that. I'm talking about chips that are shipped out typically in gondola cars, big rail cars that can be delivered anywhere. Historically, a lot of the conversion of that into finished products has taken place in areas where there are big population centers. We are a desert in terms of population. We have 4.5 million people. Texas has that many people just in Houston. So it's a much denser market in other parts, particularly the East Coast and the West Coast. So that's where a lot of the molding takes place and the fiber production, which business I used to be in. As the population increases, you would probably see more flexibility, or as the scale advantages improve, so that if you had more polymer variability available in Louisiana, not just the ones that we produce. We do produce nylon, polyester, and the various ethylenes, low density and high density and linear, and all of those things, PVC pipe. These are all the things you see in the irrigation facilities outside, the white pipe or the black pipe and the new building construction, what have you. We are probably in a position to do more with some of these big industrial type applications where there are relatively fewer customers. I don't really see us being in the business of producing, carpet liners for automobiles or things like that. But I think we could certainly do a better job, probably provide some fiscal support. I know you back that idea to try and get Louisiana more involved and at least one or two steps downstream from where we are today.
Well, yes, sir. One more question.
Yeah, it's just really more of a follow-up from some of these, distinguished panelists. I saw last week in Lafayette, Louisiana, at the Louisiana Gulf Coast Oil Exposition, which was a great event. And I just wanted to highlight the relatively perhaps lower level of activity for small to medium-sized businesses in the oil and gas industry domestically. But the international angle is really one that has a lot of opportunity. It was mentioned earlier about you're not going to do away with the West Africa Qatar competition for LNG entirely. We're competing with those export markets, but there's still the development that has to happen there, and there is an opportunity there for Louisiana expertise to participate in those markets as well, not necessarily from the LNG commodity angle, but from the expertise that goes in there, perhaps with Anadarko and Mozambique or other opportunities. So just wanted to highlight that for the benefit of especially LMOGA and others who might be interested in that angle.
Well, thank you for that comment. Well, with that, I want to thank you gentlemen for being up here. Enjoyed it, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. And I guess that wraps up the panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you.